The sunset painted the windows of Westfield Academy of Music in shades of orange and gold as the last students hurried out the doors. The prestigious school fell quiet, except for the gentle hum of Carlos Mendez's floor polisher. At 52, Carlos had been cleaning these halls for almost 15 years. His dark hair now streaked with silver, his hands rough from years of work. He moved with practiced efficiency through the empty hallways. The building felt different at this hour, peaceful in a way it never was during the day when filled with the children of doctors, business tycoons, and politicians. Carlos didn't mind the evening shift. The quiet gave him space to think, to remember, to dream a little. As he pushed his cleaning cart past the practice rooms, he paused. A soft melody drifted from behind one of the doors. Practice room 7. Someone was still here. Carlos checked his watch, nearly 7:30. The school officially closed at 7, but he never rushed the serious students out. Music needed time, his father had always said. You couldn't hurry it any more than you could hurry the ripening of fruit. The music stopped, then started again from the beginning, more hesitant this time. Carlos recognized the piece, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. His wife Maria had loved Chopin before her illness took her 5 years ago. She would play recordings on their small CD player while making dinner, humming along as if she had written the notes herself. Careful not to make noise, Carlos leaned against the wall beside the door, closing his eyes. The player inside was skilled, their timing perfect, their technique flawless. Yet something felt missing. His old guitar teacher back in Mexico would have said it lacked alma, soul. The music stopped abruptly. Carlos heard a frustrated sigh, then the sound of a phone ringing. Hello? Yes, I'm still practicing. A young woman's voice, crisp and clear. No, Daddy, I won't be late for dinner. The driver is coming at 8. Yes, I know the Wilsons will be there. No, I haven't changed my mind about Gilliard. The door opened suddenly and Carlos straightened up, caught off guard. A girl stepped out, phone pressed to her ear, not noticing him at first. She wore the school's uniform, a navy blazer over a white blouse, a pleated skirt, and polished shoes that probably cost more than Carlos made in a week. I need to use the restroom. I'll call you back, she said, ending the call. When she turned, she jumped slightly at the sight of Carlos. Oh, I didn't see you there. She wasn't rude about it, just surprised. Sorry, miss. I'm just cleaning up. Carlos gestured to his cart. Don't rush yourself. I clean this wing last. The girl, Eliza Harrington, Carlos now recognized her, gave a small nod. He knew her by sight. Her father was Philip Harrington, the famous conductor who served on the school's board. Carlos had overheard teachers talking about her talent, how she was expected to follow in her father's footsteps. Thank you, she said, then hurried down the hall toward the restrooms. Carlos wheeled his cart to the next room but stopped. The door to practice room 7 remained open, the grand piano inside still uncovered, sheet music scattered across its glossy surface. The room itself was impressive, large windows, acoustic panels on the walls, and the centerpiece, a Steinway concert grand piano worth more than Carlos would earn in 10 years. He glanced down the empty hallway, then stepped inside the room, drawn to the instrument like a moth to light. He'd never touched one of the school's pianos before. It wasn't his place. But standing there alone with no one to see, the temptation became too strong. Carefully, Carlos set down his cleaning rag and approached the piano. The black and white keys gleamed under the room's soft lighting. He reached out, his work-worn hand hovering over the keys, then pulled back. What was he doing? If someone saw him, he could lose his job. But the memory of Maria hummed in his ears. She had always wished for a real piano instead of their old keyboard. Someday, he had promised her. Someday never came. Taking a deep breath, Carlos lowered himself onto the bench. It felt wrong, like sitting in someone else's car without permission. His blue janitor's uniform looked out of place, reflected in the polished black surface of the piano. His fingers trembled slightly as he positioned them over the keys. He'd never had formal lessons, but he'd watched countless students through the small windows in the practice room doors. For years, he'd observed their finger positions, memorized the patterns they made across the keys. At home, he practiced on a paper keyboard he'd drawn, imagining the sounds. Gently, Carlos pressed down on a key. The note rang out, pure and clear, startling him with its richness, nothing like the electronic keyboard he'd saved up to buy after Maria died. He tried another key, then another, finding the first few notes of the Chopin piece Eliza had been playing. The sound pulled him in. Before he knew it, Carlos was playing, not with the technical precision of the students, but with something else. He played the way his grandfather had played the old guitar in their village, not reading notes but feeling them. He made mistakes, his untrained fingers stumbling occasionally, but the melody lived and breathed under his hands. He closed his eyes, lost in the moment, adding variations to the piece that came from somewhere deep inside him. The music filled the room, no longer just Chopin, but something new. Chopin filtered through Carlos's memories, hopes, and sorrows. So absorbed was he that Carlos didn't notice the footsteps in the hallway or the figure that appeared in the doorway. He didn't see Eliza Harrington stop short, her eyes widening as she watched the school janitor transform at her piano. It was only when he finished the piece and the final notes hung in the air that Carlos sensed he wasn't alone. He turned and saw her, his face flushing with embarrassment and fear. "Miss Harrington, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean—" He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over the bench. "Please, I'll go now." But Eliza didn't look angry. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked finally. Carlos looked down at his hands, ashamed. "I never learned, miss. Not properly. That's impossible. You were just playing Chopin. I watch the students. I listen sometimes. Sometimes I try to copy what I see and hear." He reached for his cleaning rag, desperate to return to his proper place. "I apologize for touching the piano. It won't happen again." Eliza stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Carlos's heart sank. She was going to report him. 15 years of employment gone because he couldn't resist the pull of those keys. "Play it again," she said. Carlos blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" "The part where you changed the middle section. Play it again." It wasn't a request so much as a polite command, the kind people who grew up with money learn to give. Hesitantly, Carlos sat back down. His hands shook worse now with Eliza watching, but he found the keys and began to play. This time his nervousness made his fingers stiffer, the music less fluid. He stopped after a few measures. "I can't. Not with you watching." Instead of becoming impatient, Eliza surprised him by pulling up a chair and sitting down. "Not too close, but not far away either. My father says music isn't something we own," she said, looking not at Carlos but at the wall of awards and photos displaying the school's accomplished alumni. "He says we're just borrowing it for a while, giving it our voice before passing it on." Carlos remained silent, unsure what she expected him to say. "I've been playing since I was 4 years old," she continued. 8 recitals a year, 5 international competitions, private tutors from Vienna, Moscow, and New York. She turned to look at him directly. "And I've never once played that nocturne the way you just did." "I played it wrong," Carlos said simply. "I don't know the proper notes." "No," Eliza shook her head. "You played it alive." For the first time, he noticed how tired her eyes looked despite her youth. "How long have you worked here, Mr. Mendez, Carlos Mendez?" 15 years next month. "And you've been watching students play all that time?" He nodded, still expecting repercussions. "Do you practice somewhere?" "You must practice." Carlos thought about his small apartment, the paper keyboard. The second-hand electronic one he could only play with headphones so as not to disturb the neighbors. "I have a small keyboard at home. Nothing like this." He gestured to the grand piano. Eliza was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Then, to his surprise, she slid her sheet music toward him. "Show me how you would play this part," she said, pointing to a section in the middle of the page, the part where most people slow down too much. Carlos looked at the notes, making sense of some, but not all. "I don't read music well, Miss Harrington." "Then don't read it. Just play what you feel it should sound like." Bewildered by this strange turn of events, Carlos placed his hands on the keys again. He played hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, creating a version of the passage that followed the general shape, but added subtle differences in timing and emphasis. When he finished, Eliza was staring at her own hands, deep in thought. "I have a recital in 6 weeks," she said finally. "The most important one of the year. My father's colleagues will be there, and the scholarship committee from Juilliard." Carlos nodded, not understanding where this was going. "I can play the notes perfectly," she continued. "I've been playing them perfectly for 12 years. But when you played just now, she looked up at him. When you played, I heard something I've been missing. A chime from her phone interrupted the moment. Eliza checked it and stood up. My driver is here. She gathered her sheet music, neatly tapping the pages straight. Mr. Mendez, would you be here tomorrow evening? Same time? Yes, Carlos replied, confused. I clean this floor every evening. Good. She slipped the music into her leather bag. I think we might be able to help each other. Before he could ask what she meant, Eliza was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Carlos alone with the piano and a feeling that something important had just happened, something that would change everything. Carlos couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned in his small bed, the events of the evening playing over and over in his mind like a song stuck on repeat. Had he really sat at that beautiful piano? Had Eliza Harrington, daughter of the famous Philip Harrington, really asked him to play again tomorrow? He rose before dawn, made himself a cup of strong coffee, and sat by his window watching the city slowly wake up. His tiny apartment wasn't much. A bedroom barely big enough for his bed, a living area with a worn couch, and a kitchen with appliances older than most of the students at Westfield. But it was home. In the corner stood his prized possession, the second-hand electronic keyboard he'd purchased after Maria died. Carlos walked over and switched it on, plugging in headphones so he wouldn't disturb his neighbors. His fingers found the keys, trying to recreate what he'd played on the grand piano the night before. It wasn't the same. The plastic keys felt hollow beneath his fingers, the sound thin and lifeless in his ears compared to the rich tones of the Steinway. Still, he played until it was time to leave for his day job at the grocery store, where he stocked shelves from 8 a.m. until 3 p.m. From there, he would go straight to Westfield for his evening shift. A long day, but Carlos was used to hard work. Throughout his shift at the grocery store, his mind kept wandering back to the piano, to the look on Eliza's face when she'd heard him play. No one had ever looked at him that way before, like he had something valuable to offer beyond his labor. By the time he arrived at Westfield Academy that evening, a knot of anxiety had formed in his stomach. What if Eliza had changed her mind? What if she'd told someone about finding him at the piano? What if he arrived to find the school director waiting to fire him? But the school was as it always was. The same security guard nodded to him as he signed in. The same teachers offered quick smiles as they gathered their things to leave. Nothing had changed. No one knew. Carlos began his usual routine, starting with the bathrooms, then the classrooms, working his way toward the practice rooms. As 7 o'clock approached, his hands grew clammy. He wheeled his cleaning cart down the now familiar hallway, his heart pounding as he neared practice room 7. The door was closed, but he could hear music from inside, the same Chopin nocturne played with perfect technique. Carlos hesitated, then continued past, focusing on cleaning the other rooms first. Maybe she would leave before he finished. Maybe that would be for the best. But at 7:30, as he was polishing the drinking fountain at the end of the hall, the door to practice room 7 opened. Eliza stepped out, looked around, and spotted him. Mr. Mendez, she called. You're still here? Carlos nodded, wiping his hands on his uniform pants. Yes, miss. Just finishing up. Could you come in for a moment? Her tone was polite, but carried that same hint of expecting to be obeyed that Carlos had noticed yesterday. Taking a deep breath, he followed her into the practice room. The piano sat in the center, lid open, sheet music arranged neatly on the stand. Eliza had added a second chair beside the bench. I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, she said, closing the door behind them. About how you played. Carlos braced himself. Here it came. The reprimand, the warning, perhaps even the report to his supervisor. I'd like to make you an offer, Eliza continued, surprising him. An offer? Yes, she gestured to the piano bench. Please sit down. Cautiously, Carlos sat, his work uniform feeling even more out of place in the daylight than it had in the evening shadows. Eliza took the chair beside him. I've been playing piano since before I could read. I've had the best teachers money can buy. I practice 4 hours every day. She looked down at her own hands, smooth with perfectly manicured nails so different from his calloused fingers. And yet when I play, it sounds like a machine. Perfect, but empty. Carlos didn't know what to say to this confession, so he remained silent. My final recital is in 6 weeks, she continued. It's important, not just for school but for my future. My father expects me to get into Juilliard to follow his path into classical music. You don't want to go to Juilliard? Carlos asked. Eliza's shoulders tensed slightly. It's not that. It's just... She trailed off, then shook her head. The piece I'm working on for the recital is my own composition. It needs to be perfect. The technical elements are there, but my teacher says it lacks feeling. She looked up at him. When I heard you play yesterday, I realized what he meant. Carlos shifted uncomfortably on the bench. Miss Harrington, Eliza, she corrected him. Please call me Eliza when we're alone. Eliza, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. I'm just a janitor. I don't know anything about proper music. I can't help you with your composition. But you can, she insisted. You play from your heart, not just your hands. That's exactly what I need to learn. She straightened her posture as if preparing to deliver a business proposal. Here's my offer. I'll teach you proper technique, how to read music, how to play correctly. In exchange, you help me understand how to put feeling into my composition. Carlos stared at her, trying to process what she was suggesting. You want to teach me? And I would teach you? Yes, but I'm the janitor. And I'm a student who needs help, she replied firmly. Does it matter what our official roles are? It did matter, Carlos knew. It mattered a great deal in a place like Westfield Academy. But the thought of learning to play properly, of putting his hands on that magnificent piano regularly, it was too tempting to refuse. When would we do this? He asked. Evenings after everyone has left. I told my father I need extra practice time for my composition. My driver will pick me up at 8:30 instead of 8. She looked at him expectantly. So, do we have a deal? Carlos should have said no. He should have politely declined and gone back to his cleaning cart. But instead, he heard himself say, Yes, we have a deal. Eliza smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious face. Good. Then let's begin. She reached for a folder beside her and pulled out several sheets of music. This is my composition. I'd like you to listen to it first. For the next hour, Carlos forgot he was a janitor. He forgot about his cleaning cart waiting in the hallway, about the floors he still needed to polish, about the trash cans he needed to empty. He listened as Eliza played her composition, a complex piece that showcased her impressive technical skills. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. What did you think? She asked. Carlos considered his words carefully. It's very impressive. You play beautifully. But, she prompted, sensing his hesitation. But I don't feel anything when you play, he admitted. It's like you're speaking perfect words in a language you don't understand. Instead of being offended, Eliza nodded. That's exactly what my teacher said. How do I fix it? Carlos thought about the question. When I play, I think about why I'm playing, who I'm playing for. And who do you play for, Mr. Mendez? Carlos, he corrected gently. If I'm to call you Eliza, you should call me Carlos. Carlos, she repeated. Who do you play for? He looked down at the keys, touching one softly without pressing it down. For my wife Maria, she loved music. She died 5 years ago. Eliza was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said finally. When I play, Carlos continued, I play for her. I imagine she can hear me. I try to tell her things through the music that I never said enough when she was alive. Like what? That I loved her. That she made my world beautiful. That even when we had nothing, we had everything because we had each other. He shrugged, suddenly embarrassed by his openness. It's silly. No, Eliza said softly. It's not silly at all. She stared at the piano keys, lost in thought. I don't know who I play for. My father, I suppose. My teachers. The people who come to the recitals. Perhaps that's the problem, Carlos suggested. Maybe you need to play for yourself first. Eliza considered this, then nodded slowly. Show me, she said, moving aside so Carlos could sit more centrally at the piano. Show me how you would play part of my composition. Nervously, Carlos studied the sheet music. The notes were complex, far beyond his ability to read quickly. I can't read this well enough to play it properly. Then just listen to me play it once more and play what you remember, what you feel. Eliza played a section of her composition again, a melancholy passage that reminded Carlos of rainfall. When she finished, he placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not her exact notes, but a simplified version that captured the essence of the melody. He added subtle changes, lingering on certain notes, rushing slightly through others, building a sense of longing into the music. When he finished, the room was silent. Eliza stared at the piano, then at him, her eyes wide. "That's it," she whispered. "That's what's been missing." She quickly jotted something on her sheet music.
"Can you show me which notes you changed?"
For the next half hour, they worked together, Eliza helping Carlos identify the correct keys for each note, Carlos showing her how to vary the pressure and timing to create emotional texture in the music. They were so absorbed in their work that neither noticed the time until Eliza's phone chimed. "My driver's here," she said, gathering her music. "Same time tomorrow?" Carlos nodded, suddenly remembering his neglected cleaning duties. "Yes, but I need to finish my work now or someone will notice." "Of course." Eliza paused at the door. "Thank you, Carlos." This was enlightening. After she left, Carlos rushed through his remaining tasks, his mind still swimming with music and possibilities. As he polished the hallway floor, he found himself humming Eliza's composition, adding his own variations, imagining Maria listening and smiling. For the first time in years, Carlos went home with more than just tiredness in his bones. He went home with a sense of purpose, a flicker of joy that had been missing for too long. And as he fell asleep that night, his dreams were filled with music. Not just the echoes of what had been, but the promise of what might come next. Days turned into weeks as Carlos and Eliza continued their unusual arrangement. Every evening after the school emptied, they would meet in practice room 7. The first hour was devoted to Carlos's education, Eliza patiently teaching him to read music, to position his fingers correctly, to understand the language of classical composition. The second hour belonged to Eliza's recital piece, with Carlos guiding her toward the emotional core of her music. At first, they were awkward together, the social gap between them a wall neither knew how to scale. Carlos was constantly aware of his work uniform, of his calloused hands, of the fact that he was supposed to be cleaning floors, not playing pianos. Eliza, for her part, sometimes slipped into the role of privileged student, her instructions becoming commands before she caught herself. But music has a way of breaking down walls. "No, like this," Eliza said one evening, demonstrating a difficult passage for the third time. "Your thumb needs to cross under before you reach for the black key." Carlos tried again, his fingers tangling as they had the previous 2 attempts. He sighed in frustration. "My hands are too big, too stiff for this." "Nonsense," Eliza replied. "Rachmaninoff had huge hands. It's not the size that matters, it's how you use them." She paused, then laughed at her own words. It was the first time Carlos had heard her really laugh, and he found himself smiling in response. "Here," she said, placing her hand over his to guide his fingers. "Like this." Her hand was small atop his, smooth where his was rough. But there was strength in her fingers, a pianist's strength built over years of practice. Together they moved through the passage, and this time Carlos's fingers found their way. "There," Eliza said, satisfied. "You see? It's possible." As the days passed, Carlos began to notice changes in his playing. His fingers moved more confidently across the keys. He could look at a sheet of music and translate it into sound, albeit slowly. His electronic keyboard at home, once a poor substitute for a real piano, became a valuable practice tool. But the more profound changes were happening to Eliza. Her playing, always technically flawless, began to breathe with life. She would close her eyes sometimes as she played, swaying slightly with the music in a way her formal teachers would have corrected. Her composition evolved, incorporating suggestions from Carlos, a slowed tempo here, an emphasized note there. Small changes that transformed the piece from a demonstration of skill into a story told through sound. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Eliza arrived at practice room 7 with dark circles under her eyes. "Are you okay?" Carlos asked as he set aside the sheet music he'd been studying. "Fine," she said shortly, setting her bag down with more force than necessary. "Let's just work on the adagio section. I'm still not getting it right." Carlos watched as she sat at the piano, her posture rigid, her movements sharp and angry as she arranged her music. "What happened?" he asked gently. "Nothing happened," she snapped, then immediately closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry. That was rude." "It's okay," Carlos said. "We all have bad days." Eliza stared at the piano keys without touching them. "My father listened to my composition last night," she said finally. He said it's technically acceptable but lacks sophistication. He thinks I should scrap it and play Bach for the recital instead. Something proven that will impress the Juilliard committee. Carlos digested this information. And what do you think? It doesn't matter what I think, Eliza said, a bitter edge to her voice. It never has. I think it matters very much, Carlos replied. It's your music, your recital. Eliza shook her head. You don't understand. In my family, music isn't about self-expression. It's about excellence, about carrying on a tradition. My great-grandfather played with the London Symphony. My grandfather conducted the Vienna Philharmonic. My father has won 3 Grammy Awards. And she trailed off, and you? Carlos prompted. And I'm supposed to be next in line, the next Harrington musical genius. She played a harsh chord, the discordant sound matching her mood. The problem is I don't think I love music the way they do. At least I didn't until what? She looked at him directly. Until I heard you play. Until I started working with you. For the first time, I'm beginning to understand why people dedicate their lives to this. Carlos was silent, unsure how to respond to this confession. Anyway, Eliza continued, her voice becoming businesslike again. It doesn't change anything. My father expects me to follow his plan. Does his plan make you happy? Carlos asked. The question seemed to startle her. Happy? That's not really the point. Then what is the point? Eliza opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. She turned back to the piano, playing a few soft notes before responding. I don't know anymore, she admitted. I used to think it was about being the best, making my family proud. Now I'm not so sure. They worked quietly that evening, the conversation hanging between them. As 8:30 approached, Eliza gathered her things more slowly than usual. Can I ask you something, Carlos? Of course. If you could do anything, if money and circumstances weren't obstacles, what would you do? Carlos considered the question. I would open a small music school, he said finally. Not a fancy place like this, but somewhere regular kids could learn to play. Kids who might not otherwise have the chance. He smiled, slightly embarrassed by his dream. My wife and I used to talk about it sometimes. Just daydreaming. Eliza nodded thoughtfully. That sounds wonderful. She slung her bag over her shoulder. Thank you for telling me. The next day, Carlos arrived at Westfield to find a small package waiting for him at the security desk. Delivery for you, the guard said. From that Harrington girl. Puzzled, Carlos opened the package in the privacy of the janitor's closet. Inside was a portable metronome, an expensive one from the look of it, along with several books of sheet music for beginners and a note. For your practice at home. Your dream isn't just a daydream. That night, when Eliza arrived for their session, Carlos tried to return the gifts. This is too much, he said. I can't accept these. Why not? She asked, genuinely confused. They're just practice tools. They're expensive, and I'm not a charity case, Carlos said firmly. Eliza's face fell. I didn't mean it that way. I just wanted to help, like you're helping me. Carlos softened at her obvious distress. I know, and I appreciate the thought. But our arrangement was supposed to be an even exchange. My help for yours. Gifts like this. They change things. How? She challenged. They remind us that you're the rich student and I'm the janitor. Eliza was quiet for a moment.
What if I don't see you that way anymore?
She asked finally. What if you're just Carlos to me now, my piano teacher, my friend? The word friend hung in the air between them. Is that what we are? Carlos asked. Friends? I'd like us to be, Eliza said. I don't have many real friends. People who see me, not my family name. Carlos looked at the metronome, the books. Perhaps they weren't charity after all, but something more valuable. An acknowledgement of his dreams, of his worth beyond his job title. Okay, he said. Thank you for the gifts, friend. Eliza smiled, relief evident on her face. Now shall we work on that troublesome passage from yesterday? As the 4th week of their arrangement began, Carlos noticed changes in the atmosphere at Westfield. Whispers followed him down hallways. A music teacher watched with narrowed eyes as he mopped outside practice room 7. One of the administrative assistants asked him with fake casualness if he was giving extra help to any of the students. The rumors had begun. Carlos mentioned it to Eliza that evening. People are noticing us spending time together. She waved away his concern. Let them notice. We're not doing anything wrong. Your reputation is entirely too pristine, she interrupted with a small smile. A little scandal might make me more interesting, but Carlos knew better. He'd worked at Westfield long enough to understand how things worked. Students and janitors did not become friends. They did not spend hours together in practice rooms after school. The lines between their worlds were clear, and crossing them had consequences. His fears were confirmed the next day when he was called into the director's office. Director Thomas was a tall man with the permanent expression of someone who had bitten into something sour. He did not invite Carlos to sit. "Mr. Mendez," he began, "it has come to my attention that you have been spending time with one of our students after hours." Carlos felt his heart sink. "I've been cleaning the practice rooms, sir. Sometimes students stay late to practice." "Do not insult my intelligence," Director Thomas said coldly. "Multiple sources have reported seeing you and Miss Harrington together in practice room 7. Not cleaning, Mr. Mendez. Playing the piano." Carlos said nothing, his worst fears confirmed. "I've been lenient until now because you've been a reliable employee, but this behavior is completely unacceptable. You are hired to clean, not to fraternize with students." "We're working on music together," Carlos said quietly. "That's all. That is not your place," and the director snapped. "Your place is to clean the floors, empty the trash, and leave the teaching to qualified professionals." The words stung, but Carlos stood his ground. "Miss Harrington asked for my help with her composition." Director Thomas's eyebrows rose. "And why would one of our most promising students ask for help from a janitor?" The contempt in his voice made Carlos's face burn with anger and shame. "I don't know, sir. You'd have to ask her." "Oh, I intend to," the director said. "But for now, consider this an official warning. Your job is to clean. Period. If I hear about any more piano playing, any more help with compositions, you will be looking for employment elsewhere. Am I clear?" "Very clear, sir," Carlos replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. That evening, Carlos waited for Eliza with a heavy heart. When she arrived, cheerful and ready to work, he struggled to find the words to tell her what had happened. "I can't do this anymore," he said finally. Eliza stopped arranging her music, turning to face him. "What? Why not?" "Director Thomas called me into his office today. Someone told him about our sessions. So what?" Eliza said, but her face had paled slightly. "We're not doing anything wrong. In his eyes, we are. In everyone's eyes." Carlos sighed. "I need this job, Eliza. I can't lose it." "You won't," she said firmly. "I'll talk to my father. He's on the board. He can make this go away." "And what will you tell him? That you've been getting music lessons from the janitor?" Carlos shook his head. "He'll react exactly the same way Director Thomas did. You know he will." Eliza stood silent, unable to deny it. Her father's reaction would likely be even worse. "So that's it?" she asked finally, her voice small. "We just stop? Go back to being the rich girl and the janitor who never speak to each other?" Carlos looked at the piano, remembering all they'd accomplished in the past weeks. Eliza's playing had transformed. His own skills had grown in ways he'd never imagined possible. And somewhere along the way, they'd become friends, an unlikely friendship that had come to mean a great deal to him. "I don't want to stop," he admitted. "But I don't see another way." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, then a determined expression settled on her face. "I do," she said. "I see another way." "I'm going to tell the truth," Eliza said. Her voice steadied despite the nervous tapping of her fingers against her leg. "At my recital, to everyone." Carlos stared at her. "What do you mean?" "My recital is in 2 weeks. All the important people will be there. The school board, the Juilliard committee, my father's colleagues." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm going to play my composition, our composition, and I'm going to tell them all how it came to be. How the school janitor taught me more about music in 5 weeks than all my teachers have in 12 years. "Eliza, you can't—" "I can," she interrupted, "and I will. This isn't just about us anymore, Carlos. It's about what music is supposed to be. My whole life I've been taught that music is about perfection, about impressing people. You showed me it's about connection, about feeling something and making others feel it too." Carlos rubbed his forehead, trying to process what she was suggesting. "Your father will be furious." "Probably," she agreed, a flicker of fear crossing her face before determination replaced it. "But for once in my life, I need to do what I believe is right, not what will make my father happy. And what about my job? If Director Thomas finds out we're still meeting, we'll be careful," Eliza promised. We can meet somewhere else for the next 2 weeks. My driver is loyal to me, not my father. He can pick you up at your apartment, bring you to my house when my parents are out. The suggestion shocked Carlos. Your house? That's even worse. Just the garden house, she clarified. It has a piano and no one ever goes there except the gardener, who leaves by 4. Carlos shook his head. This is crazy, Eliza. Maybe, she admitted. But I've spent my entire life being sensible, following the rules, doing what's expected. And where has it gotten me? I play perfectly, but until I met you, I never felt the music. She looked at him intently. Don't you see? This isn't just about a recital. This is about who I want to be. Carlos was silent, weighing his options. The risk was enormous. If caught, he would certainly lose his job. And yet the thought of abandoning Eliza now, of leaving their work unfinished, felt like a betrayal of something important. 2 weeks, he said finally, and then we'll see what happens. The relief on Eliza's face was immediate. Thank you, she whispered. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of secret meetings and intense practice. True to her word, Eliza arranged for her driver to pick up Carlos from his apartment, bringing him to the Harrington estate when her parents were out. The garden house was small but beautiful, with a baby grand piano that, while not as impressive as the Steinway at school, still surpassed anything Carlos had played before. Under the pressure of their deadline, both pushed themselves harder. Eliza practiced for hours, refining her composition, incorporating Carlos's suggestions while adding flourishes of her own. Carlos continued his own education, absorbing everything Eliza taught him about technique, determined to honor her risk by becoming the best student he could be. They were careful. Carlos always entered and left the estate through a side gate, never when any of the staff except the driver might see. At school they maintained their distance, Eliza nodding politely if they passed in the hallway, but nothing more. Despite their precautions, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A week before the recital, he noticed Director Thomas observing him as he cleaned the music wing, the man's eyes following him with suspicion. The next day, he overheard 2 teachers whispering his name as he passed the faculty lounge. We need to be more careful, he told Eliza that evening in the garden house. I think people are still suspicious. Eliza, deeply focused on a difficult passage in her composition, barely looked up. Just 1 more week. That's all we need. 3 days before the recital, everything fell apart. Carlos arrived at work to find Director Thomas waiting for him in the janitor's closet. Mr. Mendez, the director said coldly, I thought I made myself clear about your interactions with Miss Harrington. Carlos's stomach dropped. I've kept my distance at school, sir. Yes, at school, Director Thomas agreed with a thin smile. But I received a very interesting phone call from Philip Harrington this morning. It seems his head of security noticed some unusual activity on their estate. A certain janitor being driven to and from the garden house when the family was out. The blood drained from Carlos's face. They had been discovered. Mr. Harrington was quite disturbed by this information, as you might imagine. The director continued. He wanted to call the police, but I convinced him to let me handle it internally, given your years of service. Nothing inappropriate happened, Carlos said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. We were working on music. That's all. That is not your place, Director Thomas snapped, echoing his words from their previous conversation. You have crossed a line, Mr. Mendez. I have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Carlos had expected this, but the reality still hit him like a physical blow. 15 years. 15 years of scrubbing floors, cleaning bathrooms, polishing wood, gone in an instant. I understand, he said quietly. You will return your keys and badge to security on your way out, the director said. And Mr. Mendez, if you attempt to contact Miss Harrington again in any way, Mr. Harrington will not hesitate to involve the authorities. Carlos nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. As he gathered his few personal items from the janitor's closet, his phone vibrated with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but he immediately knew who it was. They know. Father is furious. Are you okay? He didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The threat was clear. Stay away from Eliza or face consequences beyond just losing his job. With a heavy heart, he turned in his keys and badge, then walked out of Westfield Academy for what he believed would be the last time. That night, His phone rang repeatedly, the unknown number calling again and again. He didn't answer. What could he say? Their experiment was over. The real world had intruded as he had always known it would. Around midnight, a knock came at his apartment door. Cautiously, Carlos looked through the peephole, shocked to see Eliza standing in the hallway, her face pale but determined. He opened the door. "You can't be here," he said urgently. "Your father—" "I don't care about my father right now," she interrupted, pushing past him into the small apartment. "I care that you lost your job because of me." "It wasn't because of you," Carlos said, closing the door. "It was my choice too." Eliza looked around the apartment, taking in the worn furniture, the electronic keyboard in the corner, the framed photo of Maria on the wall. It was the first time she had seen his world, and Carlos felt suddenly self-conscious of its modesty. "I'm so sorry," she said, turning back to him. "This is all my fault." "No," Carlos insisted. "We both knew the risks." "My father is wrong," Eliza said, anger flashing in her eyes. "So is Director Thomas. They had no right to do this to you." "They had every right," Carlos replied gently. "I broke the rules. I knew what I was doing." "What will you do now?" she asked, her anger giving way to concern. Carlos shrugged. "Find another job. I have some savings. I'll be okay. But the recital is no longer my concern," he said firmly. "Eliza, you need to go home. If your father discovers you're here—" "I left a note saying I was staying at my friend Lily's house," she said. "He won't check." Carlos sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "What do you want from me, Eliza?" "It's over. We tried, we failed. That's all." "It's not over," she insisted. "Not until I play our composition at the recital. Not until I tell everyone the truth." "And what will that accomplish besides angering your father further?" Carlos asked. "It won't get my job back. It won't change how the world works." "Maybe not," Eliza admitted. "But it will be honest. And maybe, just maybe, it will make someone think differently about what music is supposed to be, about who deserves to make it." Carlos looked at this young woman, barely more than a girl really, standing in his shabby apartment with the conviction of someone twice her age. In that moment he saw something of Maria in her, that same stubborn belief that the world could be better, fairer, if someone was brave enough to demand it. "You don't need me for that," he said softly. "You know the composition. You know what we were trying to do. But I do need you," Eliza insisted. "Not just for the music anymore." She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "You're the only person who's ever seen me as just Eliza, not Philip Harrington's daughter. The only one who's ever pushed me to feel something when I play, not just perform it perfectly." Carlos was silent, moved by her words but still aware of the reality of their situation. "I have a plan," Eliza said, interpreting his silence as doubt. "A way to make this right." "Eliza, just listen," she pleaded. "Please." Against his better judgment, Carlos listened as Eliza outlined her idea. It was bold, perhaps even foolish, but as she spoke, a small spark of hope kindled in his chest. "Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. It's risky," he said when she finished. "For both of us." "I know," she acknowledged. "But isn't it worth it? Isn't music worth it?" Carlos thought of all the nights he'd spent watching students practice through windows, all the melodies he'd carried in his heart with no proper way to express them. He thought of Maria and how she would have answered Eliza's question. "Yes," he said finally. "Music is worth it." Eliza's smile lit up her entire face. "Then you'll help me? One last time?" Carlos nodded, knowing he was probably making a mistake but unable to refuse. One last time. As Eliza left his apartment an hour later, plans made and decisions set, Carlos stood at his window watching her driver's car disappear into the night. He didn't know what the recital would bring, vindication or further humiliation. But for the first time since losing his job, he felt a sense of purpose returning. Whatever happened, they would face it together, through the language they both now understood, music. The night of the recital arrived with a sky full of stars and a Westfield Academy auditorium full of people. Outside the grand hall, Carlos sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, doubt gnawing at his confidence. He was dressed in his best clothes, a dark blue suit he had worn to Maria's funeral and hadn't touched since. It felt tight around the shoulders now, or perhaps it was just the weight of what he was about to do. Through the windshield, he watched well-dressed people entering the building. Parents in expensive clothes, teachers in formal attire, board members arriving in luxury cars. And somewhere inside, Eliza was waiting, counting on him to follow through with their plan. His phone vibrated with a text. "Are you here yet?" "I'm backstage." "Remember, don't come in until the second half. My piece is last," Carlos sent a quick reply. "I'm outside." "Are you sure about this?" The response came immediately. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." With a deep breath, Carlos left the car and walked toward the building. He had no right to be here anymore. He wasn't an employee, wasn't a parent, wasn't invited. But Eliza had given him explicit instructions about a side door that would be unlocked, about when to enter and where to sit. The side door was indeed unlocked, just as she had promised. Carlos slipped inside, finding himself in a dimly lit corridor that led toward the backstage area. He could hear music playing. The recital had already begun. Following Eliza's instructions, he made his way to the auditorium, staying close to the walls, finding an empty seat in the back row just as the first half was ending. The lights came up for intermission, and Carlos kept his head down, terrified of being recognized. But the people around him were strangers, parents of other students perhaps, who paid him no attention. As the crowd thinned out, heading for refreshments in the lobby, Carlos spotted familiar faces near the front of the auditorium. Director Thomas sat in the third row, his expression as sour as ever. Next to him was a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and sharp features, Philip Harrington, Carlos guessed, seeing the resemblance to Eliza. Several rows behind them sat three people with notepads, the Juilliard Committee. Most likely. The intermission ended too quickly, the audience returning to their seats, the lights dimming once more. Carlos sat with his heart pounding as student after student performed. Some played beautifully, others nervously, but all with the technical precision Westfield was known for. And then finally, the last performer was announced, Eliza Harrington, performing an original composition. A hush fell over the auditorium as Eliza walked onto the stage. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, her face solemn. She looked older somehow, more assured than the girl Carlos had first met in practice room 7. As she took her seat at the grand piano, her eyes scanned the audience, briefly meeting Carlos's gaze. The smallest smile flashed across her face before her expression returned to concentration. She began to play. The composition had evolved since Carlos had last heard it. The opening was gentler now, like a question being asked. As her fingers moved across the keys, the melody grew, building in complexity but never losing the emotional core they had worked so hard to find. Carlos could hear the technical brilliance that had been there from the beginning, but now it served the heart of the music rather than overshadowing it. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He could hear Eliza in every note, her determination, her struggle, her growth. But he could hear himself too. The longing, the grief for Maria, the joy of creation that had sustained him through hard years. Their separate stories had somehow become entwined in this single piece of music, telling a new story altogether. When the final notes faded away, the auditorium was silent. Then slowly applause began, building to enthusiastic clapping. Carlos opened his eyes to see people rising to their feet. A standing ovation forming like a wave from the back of the hall to the front. All except Philip Harrington, who remained seated, his expression unreadable, and Director Thomas beside him looking confused by the audience's reaction. Eliza stood, accepting the applause with a small bow. As the clapping began to subside, she stepped forward to the microphone at the edge of the stage. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Before I leave the stage, I'd like to say something about this composition." Carlos's heart began to race. This was it. The moment they had planned, the risk they had decided to take. "Music has always been part of my life," Eliza continued. "I've been fortunate to have the best teachers, the best instruments, the best opportunities. But until recently, I never understood what music was really about." She paused, her eyes finding Carlos again in the audience. 6 weeks ago, I discovered someone playing my piano after hours. Not a student or a teacher, but the school janitor. A murmur ran through the audience. Carlos saw Director Thomas stiffen, Philip Harrington's head snap up. "I was going to tell him to stop," Eliza said. "But then I listened. He was playing one of my pieces, playing it wrong, technically speaking. The fingering was incorrect, the timing off. But it was also more alive than anything I'd ever played myself. She took a deep breath. That janitor's name is Carlos Mendez. He taught himself music by watching students through practice room windows for 15 years. He has more natural talent than many trained musicians I know. And over the past 6 weeks, he taught me more about what music means than all my formal training combined. The murmuring grew louder. Carlos saw Philip Harrington lean over to whisper something to Director Thomas, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. The composition I just played was created with Carlos's help, Eliza continued, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the whispers. He was fired from Westfield for daring to share his knowledge with me, for crossing the line between janitor and student. She looked directly at her father now. That line shouldn't exist. Music doesn't care about job titles or family names or bank accounts. Music only cares about what's in your heart and whether you have the courage to share it. The auditorium had fallen silent again, every eye on Eliza. Carlos Mendez is here tonight, she said, and I'd like to invite him to join me on stage to play the piece we created together as it was meant to be played, as a duet. Carlos froze in his seat. This wasn't part of the plan. They had agreed she would acknowledge his contribution, yes, but not this, not a public performance. He hadn't touched a piano in days, hadn't practiced the duet version they had experimented with in the garden house. But Eliza was looking at him expectantly, her hand extended toward the audience. Slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn to follow Eliza's gaze, Carlos stood up. Director Thomas half rose from his seat. "This is outrageous," he began. But Philip Harrington placed a hand on his arm, silencing him with a look. On shaking legs, Carlos made his way to the stage steps. As he climbed them, he felt like he was in a dream. The lights were bright, the audience a blur of faces. Only Eliza was clear, standing by the piano, a smile of encouragement on her face. "We can do this," she whispered as he reached her. "Just like we practiced." Carlos nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Together they sat at the piano, adjusting the bench to make room for both of them. He could see Philip Harrington clearly now, watching them with an intensity that was impossible to read. Eliza nodded once, and they began. The duet version of the composition was different, richer, more complex, with Carlos taking the emotional heart of the melody, while Eliza wove technical brilliance around it. Their hands moved across the keys, sometimes crossing, sometimes brushing against each other, finding a rhythm together that neither could have achieved alone. Carlos forgot about the audience, forgot about Director Thomas and Philip Harrington, forgot about everything except the music and Eliza beside him, her shoulder touching his as they played. In that moment, he wasn't a janitor and she wasn't a rich girl. They were simply two musicians sharing what they loved. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted longer this time, stretching out until Carlos feared they had made a terrible mistake. Then from the back of the auditorium, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the applause building until it filled the room, louder than before. People were standing again, some wiping tears from their eyes. Carlos saw one of the Juilliard committee members scribbling frantically in her notepad, nodding with excitement to her colleagues. Eliza took his hand, pulling him to his feet for a bow. As they straightened, Carlos saw Philip Harrington slowly rise from his seat, his expression still unreadable, and begin to applaud as well. Backstage, after the recital had ended, Carlos and Eliza waited for the inevitable confrontation. It came sooner than expected, with Philip Harrington appearing in the doorway of the small practice room where they had taken refuge. "Dad," Eliza began, stepping forward. "I can explain." Philip held up a hand, silencing her. He looked at Carlos, his gaze assessing. "You're the janitor," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Carlos replied. "Former janitor." Philip nodded slowly. "My daughter says you taught her something important about music." "We taught each other," Carlos corrected gently. Philip was quiet for a moment, studying them both. Then he said something that surprised Carlos more than anything that had happened that evening. "The Juilliard committee wants to speak with you, Mr. Mendez. Both of you, actually. They were quite impressed by your performance." Eliza's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Philip confirmed. "It seems they're interested in a new scholarship program for undiscovered talent." He looked at Carlos again. "Apparently your story inspired them." Carlos couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was hearing. "You still broke the rules," Philip continued. his voice stern but not angry. Both of you. There will be consequences for that. I understand, sir, Carlos said, finding his voice at last. Do you? Philip asked. Because the consequence I'm considering is requiring you to help develop this new scholarship program. To find others like yourself who have talent but lack opportunity. Carlos stared at him in disbelief. Sir? Philip's expression softened slightly. My daughter has never defied me before. Never stood on a stage and publicly challenged everything I believe about musical education. It was unexpected. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him with cautious hope. It was also brave, he admitted. And the music you played together was, extraordinary. Different from anything I've heard at Westfield before. He sighed. Perhaps some of our traditions need challenging. Eliza stepped forward and, in a gesture that clearly surprised her father, hugged him tightly. Thank you, Dad, she whispered. Over her shoulder, Philip looked at Carlos. Don't misunderstand me, Mr. Mendez. I'm not entirely happy about any of this. But I recognize talent when I hear it, and I believe in using talent, not wasting it. I understand, sir, Carlos said. And he did understand. This wasn't a fairy tale ending where all was forgiven and forgotten. There would be difficulties ahead, adjustments to make, boundaries to navigate. But something had changed tonight. A door had opened that had previously been closed. As Philip left to speak with the Juilliard committee, promising to return shortly, Eliza turned to Carlos with shining eyes. Do you realize what this means? She asked. Your dream, the music school for regular kids. It could happen. Carlos thought about the path that had led him here, from watching through windows to performing on stage, from loneliness after Maria's death to finding connection through music. It was a path he could never have imagined when he first touched Eliza's piano 6 weeks ago. Our dream, he corrected gently. It could be our dream now. Eliza smiled, and in that smile Carlos saw the future, not perfect, not without challenges, but full of possibility and music. It was enough. It was more than enough.